Question 1. Examination of the data shows that a vendor being considered for a significant supply contract with Indian Oil Corporation Limited, IOCL, is owned and managed by a close relative of a senior manager involved in the Procurement Evaluation Committee. The senior manager is aware of this familial connection. What is the most appropriate course of action for the senior manager in this situation? Option A. Immediately disclose the familial relationship to the relevant authorities within IOCL and recuse themselves from all aspects of the vendor evaluation and selection process. Option B. Proceed with the evaluation as normal, assuming their professional integrity will prevent any bias, and not disclose the relationship to avoid potential complications. Option C. Inform the vendor directly about the evaluation process and offer guidance on how to best present their proposal to increase their chances of winning the contract. Option D. Discreetly try to ensure the vendor's proposal is viewed favorably by highlighting their strengths, while still formally participating in the evaluation. Correct answer is A. Immediately disclose the familial relationship to the relevant authorities within IOCL and recuse themselves from all aspects of the vendor evaluation and selection process. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Indian Oil Corporation Limited IOCL due to the potential conflict between personal interests and the company's ethical standards and regulatory obligations. Need for careful judgment arises from the requirement to uphold the integrity of procurement processes and avoid any perception or reality of undue influence or favoritism. Adherence to the company's code of conduct and relevant Indian laws governing public sector undertakings is paramount. The correct approach involves transparently declaring the relationship and recusing oneself from any decision-making process related to the vendor. This aligns with IOCL commitment to fair competition, ethical business practices, and preventing conflicts of interest, as typically outlined in their internal policies, and guided by principles of good governance applicable to public sector undertakings, PSUs, in India. Such transparency ensures that procurement decisions are based solely on merit, quality, and price, free from personal bias. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with evaluating the vendor without disclosure. This failure constitutes a breach of ethical conduct and potentially violates internal IOCL policies designed to prevent conflicts of interest. It creates an environment where favoritism could be perceived, undermining the fairness of the procurement process and damaging the company's reputation. Another incorrect approach is to attempt to subtly influence the evaluation in favor of the vendor, even without direct personal gain. This is a severe ethical lapse and a violation of trust. It directly contravenes the principles of impartiality and integrity expected of all IOCL employees, especially those involved in procurement. Finally, ignoring the situation and hoping it goes unnoticed is also an incorrect approach. This demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility and an unwillingness to uphold ethical standards, leaves the company vulnerable to reputational damage and potential regulatory scrutiny if the undisclosed relationship or perceived favoritism comes to light. Professionals in such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, integrity, and adherence to company policy and legal requirements. This involves 1. Identifying the potential conflict of interest. 2. Consulting relevant company policies and ethical guidelines. 3. Disclosing the conflict to the appropriate authority. 4. Recusing oneself from any involvement in the decision-making process. 5. Documenting the disclosure and recusal. Question 2. Assessment of an Indian Oil Corporation Limited, IOCL, business development manager who, after a meeting with a potential partner, inadvertently receives a document containing detailed strategic insights about a competitor's upcoming product launch. The manager is considering how to handle this information. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible and ethically sound approach, adhering to the principles expected within the Indian corporate framework? Option A. Immediately share the competitor's strategic insights with a close friend who works in a rival company, believing it might foster a more competitive market. Option B. Discreetly use the competitor's strategic insights to subtly influence IOCL internal pricing strategies for similar products without formal approval, aiming to gain a market advantage. Option C. Acknowledge receipt of the information, secure it appropriately, and consult IOCL internal policies and relevant supervisors or the compliance department to determine the appropriate course of action, prioritizing confidentiality and ethical business practices. Option D. Disregard the information entirely, assuming it was shared in error and taking no further action, as it is not directly related to IOCL immediate operational needs. The correct answer is A. Immediately share the competitor's strategic insights with a close friend who works in a rival company, believing it might foster a more competitive market. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Indian Oil Corporation Limited, IOCL, concerning the ethical handling of potentially sensitive information obtained during a business development meeting. The challenge lies in balancing the company's legitimate business interests with the ethical obligation to avoid unfair advantage or misuse of information that could impact competitors or market dynamics. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with IOCL internal policies and any applicable Indian regulations governing fair trade practices and corporate conduct. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves exercising discretion and adhering strictly to IOCL-established confidentiality policies and ethical guidelines. This means refraining from sharing the information externally or using it for personal gain or to disadvantage competitors without proper authorization or a clear business justification aligned with IOCL's strategic objectives. This approach upholds professional integrity, protects IOCL proprietary information, and ensures compliance with ethical business conduct expected of employees. It aligns with the principles of responsible corporate behavior and fair competition, which are implicitly or explicitly governed by Indian corporate law and industry best practices. Incorrect approaches analysis. Sharing the information with a close friend in a competing company without any business justification or authorization represents a significant ethical and potential regulatory failure. This action could lead to insider trading concerns, breach of confidentiality, and unfair competitive practices, potentially violating provisions of the Companies Act, 2013, or SEBI regulations if the information is market sensitive. Using the information to subtly influence future pricing strategies for IOCL without a formal strategic review process is also problematic. While internal strategic decisions are part of business, using information gained in a specific meeting without proper vetting and approval can lead to decisions that are not in the best long-term interest of IOCL or could be perceived as anti-competitive. It bypasses established decision-making protocols and could be seen as an unethical application of privileged information. Disregarding the information entirely and taking no action, even if it could benefit IOCL strategically, might be considered a failure to act in the company's best interest. However, the primary ethical concern in this scenario is the misuse or inappropriate disclosure of information. While inaction can have consequences, the immediate and more severe ethical breach lies in the potential for misuse or unauthorized disclosure. The critical failure in this approach is not the inaction itself, but the missed opportunity to act ethically and strategically if the information warranted it, while still maintaining confidentiality. The most critical failure is the potential for misuse or unauthorized disclosure. Professional reasoning. Professionals at IOCL should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct, adherence to company policy, and compliance with Indian laws. When faced with sensitive information, the process should involve 1. Identifying the nature and sensitivity of the information. 2. Consulting IOCL internal policies on confidentiality, information sharing, and ethical conduct. 3. Seeking guidance from their supervisor or the legal/compliance department if there is any ambiguity. 4. Acting only in ways that are authorized, transparent, and in the best interest of IOCL, while respecting fair competition and regulatory requirements. Question 3. Which approach would be most appropriate for an Indian Oil Corporation Limited employee who has been offered a significant personal gift by a vendor currently in the process of bidding for a major contract with IOCL? Option A. Attempt to negotiate the gift to a lesser value before disclosing it to IOCL. Option B. Immediately disclose the offer to the designated authority within IOCL and recuse oneself from any involvement in the vendor selection process. Option C. Ignore the offer and continue with the vendor selection process without any disclosure. Option D. Accept the gift and proceed with the vendor selection process, assuming personal integrity will prevent any bias. The correct answer is B. Immediately disclose the offer to the designated authority within IOCL and recuse oneself from any involvement in the vendor selection process. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Indian Oil Corporation Limited IOCL, where a potential conflict of interest arises. The employee has been offered a significant personal benefit from a vendor who is actively seeking a contract with IOCL. This situation is professionally challenging because it directly impacts the integrity of the procurement process and the company's reputation. The employee must navigate this situation with utmost discretion and adherence to ethical standards and internal policies to avoid any perception or reality of undue influence or favoritism. The potential for personal gain to cloud professional judgment is high, necessitating a robust decision-making framework. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves immediately disclosing the offer to the appropriate authority within IOCL, such as the HR department or the compliance officer, and recusing oneself from any decision-making process related to the vendor in question. This aligns with the principles of corporate governance and ethical conduct expected of employees in public sector undertakings like IOCL. Indian Oil's internal policies and the broader regulatory framework governing public sector enterprises in India emphasize transparency, accountability, and the avoidance of conflicts of interest. By disclosing the offer, the employee upholds their fiduciary duty to the company and ensures that procurement decisions are made impartially, based on merit and the best interests of IOCL, rather than personal inducements. This proactive disclosure prevents potential ethical breaches and legal ramifications. Incorrect approaches analysis. Accepting the offer without disclosure would be a severe ethical and regulatory failure. It would constitute a breach of trust and could be construed as an attempt to gain personal advantage through improper means, potentially violating provisions related to bribery and corruption under Indian law, as well as IOCL Code of Conduct. Negotiating the offer to reduce its perceived value before disclosing it is also an incorrect approach. This action still implies an intent to benefit personally from the vendor relationship and attempts to circumvent the spirit of disclosure policies. It does not resolve the fundamental conflict of interest and could be seen as an attempt to conceal the initial impropriety. Ignoring the offer and continuing with the vendor selection process without any disclosure or recusal is equally problematic. While the employee might believe they can remain impartial, the existence of the offer creates an undeniable conflict of interest and a significant risk of bias, even if unintentional. This approach fails to address the ethical dilemma and leaves IOCL vulnerable to decisions influenced by undisclosed personal considerations. Professional reasoning. Professionals in organizations like IOCL should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical conduct and adherence to organizational policies. This framework typically involves 1. Identifying the ethical dilemma or potential conflict of interest. 2. Consulting relevant company policies, codes of conduct, and applicable laws. 3. Seeking guidance from designated authorities e.g., HR, compliance, legal. 4. Disclosing the situation transparently and promptly. 5. Recusing oneself from any decision-making processes where a conflict exists. 6. Documenting all actions taken and advice received. This structured approach ensures that decisions are made with integrity, safeguarding both the individual's professional standing and the organization's reputation and interests. Question 4. Implementation of a new pricing strategy by a competitor has led to a noticeable shift in market dynamics, with certain commodity prices appearing to be artificially influenced. An employee at Indian Oil Corporation Limited IOCL observes this trend and suspects potential market manipulation. What is the most appropriate course of action for the IOCL employee? Option A. Discreetly report the observed potential price manipulation to the IOCL Internal Compliance Department for investigation. Option B. Ignore the observation as it does not directly impact IOCL immediate operational performance and focus on core responsibilities. Option C. Investigate the competitor's pricing strategy further to understand its impact and potentially leverage this information for personal trading. Option D. Share the observations about the competitor's pricing strategy with industry contacts to gauge their opinions and potential market reactions. The correct answer is A. Discreetly report the observed potential price manipulation to the IOCL Internal Compliance Department for investigation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Indian Oil Corporation Limited IOCL regarding the ethical handling of sensitive information. The challenge lies in balancing the company's need for competitive intelligence with the imperative to act with integrity and avoid any actions that could be construed as insider trading or unfair market manipulation, even if not explicitly illegal under current regulations. The employee must exercise sound judgment to uphold IOCL reputation and adhere to its internal code of conduct. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves discreetly reporting the observed potential price manipulation to the relevant internal compliance department at IOCL. This aligns with the principles of corporate governance and ethical conduct expected of employees in a listed company. By escalating the concern through official channels, the employee ensures that IOCL can investigate the matter appropriately, potentially through its legal and compliance teams, and take necessary actions to protect its interests and comply with any applicable SEBI, Securities and Exchange Board of India, regulations or guidelines that govern market integrity. This proactive and responsible reporting demonstrates integrity and commitment to fair market practices. Incorrect approaches analysis. Pursuing the information further to gain a personal advantage or to directly inform trading decisions would be an ethical failure. It could lead to accusations of insider trading, even if the information is not yet material non-public information, and would violate the trust placed in the employee by IOCL. This approach prioritizes personal gain over corporate responsibility and ethical conduct. Sharing the information with external parties, such as friends or family, without proper authorization is a breach of confidentiality and could have severe repercussions. This action could inadvertently facilitate market manipulation or insider trading by others, thereby exposing IOCL to regulatory scrutiny and reputational damage. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of data security and ethical information handling. Ignoring the observation and taking no action is also an incorrect approach. While it might seem like avoiding involvement, it represents a failure to act responsibly when witnessing potential market irregularities. This inaction could be interpreted as tacit approval or negligence, potentially implicating IOCL if the manipulation is later discovered and linked to a lack of internal oversight. It undermines the company's commitment to a fair and transparent market. Professional reasoning. Professionals in organizations like IOCL should adopt a framework that prioritizes ethical conduct, adherence to internal policies, and compliance with regulatory guidelines. When faced with situations involving potential market manipulation or the misuse of sensitive information, the decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying the ethical dilemma and potential risks to the company and oneself. 2. Consulting internal policies and codes of conduct for guidance. 3. Escalating concerns through designated internal channels, e.g., Compliance Department, Legal Counsel. 4. Avoiding any personal gain or disclosure of information that could compromise market integrity or confidentiality. 5. Documenting actions taken and seeking clarification when in doubt. Question 5. The audit findings indicate that certain critical safety equipment at an Indian oil refinery is nearing the end of its operational life and may not meet current Directorate General of Hydrocarbons, DGH, safety guidelines, potentially increasing the risk of environmental incidents. The Finance Department is pushing for a delay in replacement to conserve capital for the current fiscal year. What is the most appropriate course of action for the refinery management? Option A. Seek a temporary waiver from the DGH for the non-compliant equipment while planning for eventual replacement. Option B. Implement minor, cosmetic repairs to the existing equipment to give the appearance of compliance and postpone major replacements. Option C. Immediately initiate the procurement and installation process for the replacement of the safety equipment, aligning with DGH guidelines and relevant environmental regulations. Option D. Defer the replacement of the safety equipment to the next financial year, provided a risk assessment indicates the immediate probability of an incident is low. The correct answer is C. Immediately initiate the procurement and installation process for the replacement of the safety equipment, aligning with DGH guidelines and relevant environmental regulations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for cost saving with the long-term implications of compromising on essential safety and environmental standards. Indian Oil, as a major energy company, operates under stringent regulatory frameworks designed to protect public health, safety, and the environment. Decisions made in such situations have significant legal, financial, and reputational consequences. The pressure to reduce operational expenses must be weighed against the absolute imperative to comply with all applicable Indian laws and regulations governing its operations. The correct approach involves prioritizing compliance with the Directorate General of Hydrocarbons, DGH, guidelines and the Environment Protection Act, 1986, and its associated rules. This approach is right because it upholds the legal and ethical obligations of Indian Oil. Adhering to these regulations ensures that the company operates safely, minimizes environmental impact, and avoids potential penalties, litigation, and reputational damage. The DGH guidelines specifically address safety standards in the hydrocarbon sector, while the Environment Protection Act mandates measures to prevent and control pollution. By choosing to invest in necessary upgrades, the company demonstrates a commitment to responsible corporate citizenship and sustainable operations, which are critical for long-term viability and public trust. An incorrect approach that suggests deferring the upgrades to the next financial year, despite the audit findings highlighting potential noncompliance, fails to acknowledge the immediate risks. This could lead to violations of the Factories Act, 1948, and the Petroleum Rules, 1976, which prescribe safety standards for industrial establishments and the handling of petroleum products, respectively. Such a deferral would expose Indian Oil to potential accidents, environmental damage, and regulatory enforcement actions, including fines and operational shutdowns. Another incorrect approach that proposes seeking a temporary waiver from regulatory bodies is also professionally unacceptable. Waivers might exist in specific, limited circumstances. They are not a substitute for fundamental compliance with safety and environmental laws. Attempting to circumvent established regulations, even temporarily, undermines the integrity of the regulatory system and demonstrates a disregard for the public interest. This could be seen as a violation of the principles of good corporate governance and could attract severe penalties if discovered. A third incorrect approach that involves implementing only minor, cosmetic changes without addressing the core issues identified in the audit is equally flawed. This superficial response would not rectify the underlying safety or environmental risks. It would likely be identified during subsequent inspections, leading to further scrutiny and potential penalties. It also signals a lack of genuine commitment to safety and environmental stewardship, which can erode stakeholder confidence. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a thorough risk assessment, a clear understanding of the relevant regulatory landscape, including specific acts, rules, and guidelines applicable to Indian Oil's operations in India, and an evaluation of the potential consequences of different courses of action. Professionals must prioritize compliance and safety, even when faced with financial pressures. This involves transparent communication with regulatory bodies, seeking expert advice when necessary, and ensuring that all decisions align with the company's ethical commitments and legal obligations. Question 6. During the evaluation of a new pipeline project for Indian Oil Corporation Limited, which approach to risk assessment would best ensure compliance with Indian environmental regulations and safeguard the company's reputation? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment involving environmental experts, regulatory bodies, and local community representatives to identify all potential environmental hazards and develop robust mitigation strategies aligned with the Environment Protection Act, 1986. Option B. Prioritize cost-effectiveness by adopting the least expensive risk mitigation measures, assuming minimal environmental impact based on historical data from similar projects. Option C. Implement a reactive risk management strategy, addressing environmental concerns only if they arise during or after the project's operational phase. Option D. Rely on internal engineering assessments alone, focusing primarily on operational risks and assuming regulatory compliance will be met through standard operating procedures. The correct answer is B. Prioritize cost-effectiveness by adopting the least expensive risk mitigation measures, assuming minimal environmental impact based on historical data from similar projects. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires Indian Oil's risk assessment team to balance the need for operational efficiency and cost-effectiveness with the imperative to comply with stringent environmental regulations and maintain public trust. The potential for environmental damage, coupled with the reputational risk to Indian Oil, necessitates a thorough and proactive approach to risk identification and mitigation. The correct approach involves a comprehensive, multi-stakeholder risk assessment that prioritizes potential environmental impacts and regulatory compliance. This approach is right because it aligns with the principles of responsible corporate citizenship and the legal framework governing environmental protection in India. Specifically, it adheres to the spirit and letter of environmental laws such as the Environment Protection Act, 1986, and associated rules, which mandate proactive measures to prevent pollution and mitigate environmental harm. By engaging with regulatory bodies and local communities, Indian Oil demonstrates transparency and a commitment to sustainable operations, thereby reducing the likelihood of penalties, legal challenges, and reputational damage. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost savings without adequately assessing environmental risks would fail to meet regulatory obligations. This could lead to significant fines, operational disruptions due to environmental noncompliance, and severe damage to Indian Oil's brand image. Another incorrect approach that relies on outdated risk assessment methodologies would be insufficient in identifying emerging environmental threats or understanding the nuances of current regulatory requirements, leaving the company vulnerable to unforeseen incidents and noncompliance. Finally, an approach that neglects stakeholder engagement, particularly with local communities and environmental agencies, risks alienating key parties and creating an adversarial relationship, which can escalate into significant operational and reputational challenges. Professionals in such situations should employ a structured risk management framework that includes identifying potential hazards and their impacts, assessing the likelihood and severity of these impacts, evaluating existing controls, and developing mitigation strategies. This process must be iterative and informed by current regulatory landscapes, technological advancements, and stakeholder feedback. A commitment to continuous improvement and a proactive stance on environmental stewardship are crucial for long-term sustainability and corporate responsibility. Question 7. Compliance review shows that the process for managing waste oil at a specific Indian oil refinery has become a significant bottleneck, leading to delays in production and increased operational costs. The refinery manager is keen to implement a new, faster disposal method proposed by a junior engineer, which promises to reduce processing time by 30%. However, this proposed method has not undergone a full environmental impact assessment or been formally approved by the company's Safety and Compliance Department. Which of the following represents the most appropriate approach for the refinery manager to consider in addressing this process optimization challenge? Option A. Initiate a formal review process involving the Environmental, Health, and Safety A's Department, along with relevant operational teams, to assess the feasibility, safety, and regulatory compliance of the proposed method before any implementation. Option B. Authorize the junior engineer to proceed with a small-scale pilot of the new method without formal EHS review based on his confidence in its effectiveness. Option C. Defer any changes to the waste oil disposal process until a broader company-wide initiative for process optimization is launched to ensure consistency across all facilities. Option D. Immediately approve and implement the junior engineer's proposed faster disposal method to achieve the desired efficiency gains and cost savings. The correct answer is D. Immediately approve and implement the junior engineer's proposed faster disposal method to achieve the desired efficiency gains and cost savings. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the pursuit of operational efficiency with strict adherence to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct within Indian Oil. The pressure to optimize processes, a common business objective, can sometimes lead to shortcuts or overlooking critical procedural steps if not managed carefully. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that efficiency gains do not compromise safety, environmental standards, or data integrity, all of which are heavily regulated in the oil and gas sector. The correct approach involves a systematic and documented review of existing processes, identifying bottlenecks, and proposing changes that are validated for their impact on efficiency, safety, and compliance. This approach is professionally sound because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the current state before implementing changes. It aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and operational excellence, which are implicitly expected of employees in a company like Indian Oil. Specifically, It adheres to the spirit of regulatory frameworks that mandate responsible operations, risk management, and continuous improvement. By involving relevant stakeholders and conducting pilot tests, this approach ensures that proposed optimizations are practical, safe, and compliant with Indian Oil's internal policies and external regulations, such as those governing environmental protection and operational safety in the petroleum industry. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction without a comprehensive risk assessment fails to consider the potential for increased safety hazards or environmental incidents, which could lead to severe regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and operational disruptions. This overlooks the fundamental regulatory requirement for responsible and safe operations. Another incorrect approach that bypasses established approval protocols for process changes, even if seemingly minor, undermines internal control mechanisms designed to ensure compliance and prevent unintended consequences. This violates principles of accountability and due diligence. A third incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or the experience of a single individual without rigorous data analysis or validation risks implementing inefficient or even unsafe changes. This lacks the systematic, evidence-based decision-making expected in a regulated industry and could lead to non-compliance with performance standards. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the problem or opportunity, followed by gathering comprehensive data and understanding the existing regulatory landscape. They should then brainstorm potential solutions, rigorously evaluating each against criteria of efficiency, safety, environmental impact, and regulatory compliance. Implementing changes should be done in a phased, controlled manner with continuous monitoring and feedback loops to ensure desired outcomes are achieved without compromising compliance or safety. Question 8. Performance analysis shows that a key project at Indian Oil requires an immediate hire for a specialized technical role. A candidate with strong industry experience and a personal recommendation from a senior manager has been identified. However, this candidate has only partially completed the mandatory online assessment module as per the Indian Oil Hiring Assessment Test Guidelines, citing technical difficulties. The hiring manager is under pressure to expedite the onboarding process. Option A. Proceed with the hiring of the candidate after verifying their experience through additional interviews and reference checks, while documenting the partial completion of the assessment and the reasons for the deviation. Option B. Inform the senior manager that the candidate cannot be considered until the assessment is fully completed as per the Indian Oil Hiring Assessment Test requirements, and explore other candidates who have met all assessment criteria. Option C. Recommend hiring the candidate based on the senior manager's recommendation and their apparent experience, considering the urgency, and address the assessment completion post-onboarding. Option D. Request the candidate to immediately complete the outstanding sections of the online assessment, even if it delays the onboarding by a few days, to ensure full compliance with the Indian Oil Hiring Assessment Test protocols. Correct answer is A. Proceed with the hiring of the candidate after verifying their experience through additional interviews and reference checks, while documenting the partial completion of the assessment and the reasons for the deviation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing operational efficiency with adherence to the specific regulatory framework governing Indian Oil's hiring processes. The pressure to fill critical roles quickly can tempt individuals to bypass established procedures, potentially leading to non-compliance and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions align with the Indian Oil Hiring Assessment Test Guidelines, which are designed to ensure fairness, transparency, and the selection of qualified candidates. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the candidate's qualifications against the defined criteria for the role, as stipulated by Indian Oil's internal hiring policies and any relevant industry-specific guidelines applicable in India. This ensures that the selection process is objective and defensible, adhering to the spirit and letter of the assessment test's requirements. This approach is justified by the need for merit-based selection, preventing bias, and maintaining the integrity of the hiring process, which are fundamental principles in any regulated hiring environment like that of a public sector undertaking in India. An incorrect approach that involves prioritizing a candidate based on personal acquaintance or perceived immediate need without a formal assessment would be a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This bypasses the structured evaluation process mandated by the Indian Oil Hiring Assessment Test, potentially leading to the selection of an underqualified individual and creating grounds for accusations of favoritism or unfair practice. Another incorrect approach, such as fabricating or altering assessment results to fit a desired outcome, constitutes a severe breach of ethical conduct and regulatory compliance, undermining the entire purpose of the assessment and potentially leading to legal repercussions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the assessment test's objectives and the specific criteria for the role. When faced with a situation where a candidate appears suitable but has not fully completed the prescribed assessment, the professional reasoning should involve consulting the assessment guidelines for exceptions or alternative verification methods. If no such provisions exist, the correct course of action is to ensure the candidate completes the assessment as required, even if it causes a slight delay, rather than compromising the integrity of the process. This systematic approach prioritizes compliance and fairness over expediency. Question 9. The control framework reveals that an employee of Indian Oil Corporation Limited (IOCL) has received an unsolicited tip from a senior executive regarding an upcoming, unannounced significant acquisition that is expected to substantially increase the company's share price. The employee is considering whether to purchase additional shares of IOCL. Which of the following actions represents the most professionally responsible and legally compliant approach? Option A. Refrain from purchasing any IOCL shares and immediately report the receipt of this information, along with the potential conflict of interest, to the IOCL Compliance Department. Option B. Ignore the tip, assuming it might be speculative, and continue with normal business activities without taking any action or reporting it. Option C. Immediately purchase additional IOCL shares, as the tip is from a senior executive and likely accurate, presenting a clear opportunity for personal financial gain. Option D. Discuss the tip with a few trusted colleagues to gauge their opinions on the potential impact and whether they plan to trade. The correct answer is C. Immediately purchase additional IOCL shares, as the tip is from a senior executive and likely accurate, presenting a clear opportunity for personal financial gain. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Indian Oil Corporation Limited (IOCL) due to the inherent conflict between personal financial interests and the company's ethical conduct and regulatory compliance obligations. The need for careful judgment arises from the potential for insider trading, which is strictly prohibited under Indian securities laws and IOCL internal policies. Maintaining the integrity of the market and safeguarding the company's reputation are paramount. The correct approach involves strictly adhering to the Securities and Exchange Board of India (SEBI) regulations concerning insider trading and IOCL own code of conduct. This means refraining from trading in the company's securities while in possession of unpublished price-sensitive information (UPSI), and reporting any potential conflicts of interest or receipt of such information to the designated compliance officer. This approach is justified by SEBI Prohibition of Insider Trading Regulations, 2015, which define UPSI and prohibit its use for trading. IOCL internal policies, aligned with these regulations, further reinforce the ethical obligation to prevent insider trading and ensure fair market practices. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with trading based on the tip. This constitutes a direct violation of SEBI regulations, specifically Regulation 3, which prohibits communicating UPSI to any person, other than in furtherance of legitimate purposes or discharging of legal obligations, or for the purpose of performance of duties, or for any other reason, which is not in contravention of the provisions of these regulations. It also violates Regulation 4, which prohibits insider trading. Ethically, it undermines the principle of fair disclosure and equal access to information for all investors, creating an unfair advantage. Another incorrect approach would be to discuss the information with other colleagues before deciding whether to trade. This action, even without immediate trading, could be construed as communicating UPSI, thereby violating Regulation 3 of the SEBI, Prohibition of Insider Trading Regulations, 2015. It increases the risk of information leakage and potential market manipulation. A third incorrect approach would be to ignore the information and continue with normal business activities without any internal reporting. While not directly trading, failing to report the receipt of potential UPSI to the compliance officer, as mandated by IOCL Internal Code of Conduct and Good Corporate Governance Practices, is a failure to act responsibly. This oversight could lead to a situation where the information is inadvertently disclosed or acted upon by others, creating a compliance breach. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve 1. Immediate recognition of the potential for UPSI. 2. Strict adherence to personal trading restrictions while in possession of such information. 3. Prompt and confidential reporting of the information and the situation to the designated compliance officer or legal department. 4. Seeking guidance from the compliance officer on the appropriate course of action, which typically involves abstaining from any trading until the information is made public. 5. Maintaining confidentiality of the information. Question 10. Process analysis reveals that a vendor supplying critical raw materials to Indian Oil Corporation Limited (IOCL) offers an employee in the procurement department a high-value gift as a token of appreciation for facilitating timely payments. The employee is aware of IOCL's strict policies on gifts and the provisions of the Prevention of Corruption Act, 1988. Considering the stakeholder perspective, which of the following actions best upholds ethical conduct and regulatory compliance for the IOCL employee? Option A. Accept the gift and return it later without informing anyone to avoid any potential awkwardness. Option B. Accept the gift, assuming its value is below the threshold that would typically raise concerns. Option C. Accept the gift discreetly, as the vendor is a long-standing partner and the gesture is purely a sign of goodwill. Option D. Decline the gift politely and immediately inform the supervisor and the company's ethics department about the offer. The correct answer is C. Accept the gift discreetly, as the vendor is a long-standing partner and the gesture is purely a sign of goodwill. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Indian Oil Corporation Limited (IOCL) due to the inherent conflict between personal gain and the company's ethical standards and regulatory obligations. The need for careful judgment arises from the potential for even a seemingly minor personal transaction to create an appearance of impropriety, which can have significant repercussions for both the individual and the company's reputation. Adherence to the company's code of conduct and relevant Indian laws is paramount. The correct approach involves prioritizing transparency and adherence to IOCL-established policies and the Prevention of Corruption Act, 1988. This approach recognizes that employees are expected to act with integrity and avoid situations that could compromise their professional duties or create a conflict of interest. Specifically, seeking prior written approval from the competent authority within IOCL before accepting any gift or favor, regardless of its perceived value, aligns with the principles of good governance and ethical conduct mandated by the company and reinforced by legislation designed to prevent bribery and corruption. This proactive disclosure ensures that any potential conflict is assessed and managed appropriately by the organization. An incorrect approach would be to accept the gift without disclosure, assuming its value is negligible. This fails to acknowledge the potential for even small favors to establish a quid pro quo or create an obligation, thereby violating the spirit of the Prevention of Corruption Act, 1988, which aims to curb corruption in all its forms. It also breaches IOCL internal code of conduct, which typically requires disclosure of gifts and hospitality to maintain a clear ethical boundary. Another incorrect approach would be to rationalize the acceptance of the gift by believing that the supplier is merely expressing gratitude. While gratitude is a positive sentiment, accepting gifts from business associates without proper authorization can be misconstrued as an inducement or reward for past or future business, directly contravening the principles of fair dealing and potentially leading to accusations of favoritism or corruption. This approach overlooks the strict regulatory environment governing public sector undertakings like IOCL. A third incorrect approach would be to discreetly return the gift after acceptance, without informing IOCL management. While returning the gift might seem like a corrective action, the initial acceptance without disclosure still represents a breach of protocol and an ethical lapse. Furthermore, the supplier might interpret the return as a rejection of their goodwill, potentially straining the business relationship, without addressing the underlying ethical concern or fulfilling the disclosure requirement. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of IOCL code of conduct and relevant Indian laws. When faced with a potential conflict of interest or an offer of a gift, the employee should immediately consider the implications for their role in the company. The default action should be to err on the side of caution and seek guidance or approval from their superior or the designated ethics officer. This proactive stance, rooted in transparency and adherence to policy, is the most effective way to maintain professional integrity and safeguard the company's interests. Question 11. Governance review demonstrates that Indian Oil's strategic expansion plan into a new geographical region requires significant infrastructure development. A key stakeholder group has raised concerns about potential environmental impacts and the need for adherence to local land acquisition laws. The project team is eager to commence construction to meet aggressive market entry deadlines. Which of the following actions best reflects the appropriate governance and compliance approach for Indian Oil in this situation? Option A. Halt all progress on the expansion plan until a comprehensive environmental impact assessment and full legal review of land acquisition processes are completed and approved by all relevant Indian authorities and Indian Oil's internal compliance department. Option B. Proceed with construction immediately, addressing environmental and land acquisition concerns reactively as they arise to meet market entry deadlines. Option C. Delegate the responsibility for environmental and land acquisition compliance entirely to the local project management team, trusting their judgment to navigate the complexities. Option D. Initiate construction on non-critical infrastructure components, while deferring the resolution of environmental and land acquisition issues for the main project elements until later. The correct answer is B. Proceed with construction immediately, addressing environmental and land acquisition concerns reactively as they arise to meet market entry deadlines. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's strategic growth objectives and the stringent regulatory compliance requirements mandated by Indian Oil's operational framework. Balancing the need for swift decision-making to capitalize on market opportunities with the imperative to uphold all applicable laws and internal policies requires careful judgment and a robust understanding of governance principles. The pressure to deliver results can sometimes lead to shortcuts, which, if not properly managed, can result in significant legal and reputational damage. The correct approach involves prioritizing adherence to the established regulatory framework and internal governance policies of Indian Oil. This means that any proposed strategic initiative, regardless of its perceived urgency or potential benefit, must first undergo a thorough review to ensure it aligns with all relevant laws, including those pertaining to environmental impact, labor practices, and financial transparency, as well as Indian Oil's own code of conduct and risk management guidelines. This approach is ethically sound and legally defensible, as it demonstrates a commitment to responsible corporate citizenship and protects the company from potential penalties and liabilities. It upholds the principle of doing things right rather than just doing things fast. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the strategic initiative without obtaining the necessary regulatory approvals or conducting the mandated due diligence. This could manifest as overlooking potential environmental concerns to expedite project timelines, or bypassing internal financial controls in the pursuit of rapid expansion. Such actions would constitute a direct violation of Indian Oil's regulatory obligations and ethical standards, potentially leading to fines, sanctions, operational disruptions, and severe damage to the company's reputation. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on informal assurances or verbal agreements from regulatory bodies without securing formal documentation, which leaves the company vulnerable to future disputes and non-compliance claims. Professionals in such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. This involves clearly identifying the regulatory and policy requirements applicable to the proposed action. They should then assess the potential risks and benefits of proceeding, with a strong emphasis on the compliance risks. Seeking expert advice from legal and compliance departments is crucial. The decision should be based on a comprehensive understanding of the regulatory landscape and Indian Oil's internal governance framework, ensuring that all actions are documented and justifiable. Prioritizing long-term sustainability and ethical conduct over short-term gains is paramount. Question 12. The assessment process reveals that one candidate, Mr. Sharma, has a family connection to a senior executive within Indian Oil. While this information is not directly related to the assessment criteria for the role he is applying for, it has surfaced during informal pre-assessment discussions. As an assessor, how should you proceed to ensure the integrity and fairness of the hiring process for Indian Oil? Option A. Objectively evaluate Mr. Sharma's performance against the defined assessment criteria, ensuring no external information influences the evaluation, and report any potential conflict of interest through the designated internal channels if deemed necessary by policy. Option B. Focus the assessment questions on areas where Mr. Sharma might be perceived as weaker, given his potential insider advantage, to rigorously test his fundamental knowledge. Option C. Consider Mr. Sharma's family connection as a potential indicator of his suitability and network within the organization, subtly factoring this into the overall assessment score. Option D. Discreetly inform the senior executive about Mr. Sharma's application and the assessment progress, seeking their informal opinion on Mr. Sharma's potential fit. The correct answer is A. Objectively evaluate Mr. Sharma's performance against the defined assessment criteria, ensuring no external information influences the evaluation, and report any potential conflict of interest through the designated internal channels if deemed necessary by policy. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a candidate to demonstrate an understanding of how to ethically and effectively manage information obtained during an assessment process, particularly when that information could be perceived as sensitive or potentially advantageous. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need for thoroughness in an assessment with the ethical obligation to maintain confidentiality and avoid any appearance of impropriety. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the assessment remains fair, objective, and compliant with Indian Oil's internal hiring policies and relevant employment laws. The correct approach involves a commitment to objective evaluation based solely on the assessment criteria and the candidate's performance during the test. This aligns with the principles of fair hiring practices, which are implicitly governed by Indian employment law and the ethical standards expected of a reputable organization like Indian Oil. By focusing on the established assessment parameters and avoiding any undue influence from external or perceived information, the assessor upholds the integrity of the hiring process. This ensures that all candidates are evaluated on a level playing field, preventing bias and promoting meritocracy, which are fundamental to ethical recruitment. An incorrect approach would be to allow the perceived insight into a candidate's background, obtained through informal channels or prior knowledge, to unduly influence the assessment. This introduces bias and undermines the objectivity of the evaluation. Such an approach could lead to discriminatory practices, violating principles of equal opportunity enshrined in Indian employment legislation. Furthermore, it breaches the ethical duty of impartiality expected of anyone involved in the hiring process, potentially leading to legal challenges and reputational damage for Indian Oil. Another incorrect approach would be to prematurely dismiss a candidate based on assumptions derived from this perceived insight, without allowing them to demonstrate their capabilities through the formal assessment. This is unfair and potentially discriminatory, as it denies the candidate an opportunity to prove their suitability for the role. It also fails to adhere to the structured assessment process designed to identify the best talent, irrespective of any preconceived notions. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear adherence to established assessment protocols and a conscious effort to compartmentalize any external information from the formal evaluation. Assessors must be trained to recognize and mitigate potential biases. If any information obtained outside the formal assessment process seems relevant, it should be handled through appropriate channels, such as HR, rather than being directly incorporated into the assessment judgment. The primary focus must always remain on the objective criteria defined for the role and the candidate's performance against those criteria within the assessment itself. Question 13. Benchmark analysis indicates that a new refining process at an Indian Oil Corporation Limited (IOCL) facility has the potential to increase operational efficiency, but may also generate novel waste streams. What is the most appropriate risk assessment approach for IOCL to adopt in this situation, ensuring compliance with Indian environmental laws and promoting sustainable operations? Option A. Initiate a preliminary risk assessment based on existing waste management protocols, without specifically investigating the characteristics of the novel waste streams. Option B. Rely on the experience of long-serving plant operators to informally gauge the environmental risks associated with the new waste streams. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment (IA) involving expert consultation and a detailed analysis of potential waste streams and their management, aligning with the Environment Protection Act, 1986, and relevant rules. Option D. Prioritize the immediate implementation of the new process to achieve production targets, deferring detailed environmental risk assessment until operational issues arise. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive environmental impact assessment (IA) involving expert consultation and a detailed analysis of potential waste streams and their management, aligning with the Environment Protection Act, 1986, and relevant rules. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Indian Oil Corporation Limited (IOCL) due to the inherent conflict between operational efficiency and the imperative to adhere to stringent environmental regulations. The pressure to meet production targets can create a temptation to overlook or downplay potential environmental risks, requiring careful judgment to balance business objectives with legal and ethical obligations. Correct approach involves a proactive and transparent risk assessment process that prioritizes compliance with the Environment Protection Act, 1986, and relevant rules like the Hazardous Waste Management, Handling and Transboundary Movement Rules, 2016, and the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, 1974. This approach ensures that potential environmental impacts are identified, evaluated, and mitigated before they escalate into non-compliance issues. It aligns with IOCL commitment to sustainable operations and its responsibility to prevent pollution. By engaging with environmental experts and regulatory bodies, the company demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to responsible corporate citizenship, thereby safeguarding its reputation and avoiding potential legal penalties. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost savings without a thorough environmental risk assessment would be professionally unacceptable. This failure to consider regulatory requirements, such as those stipulated by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, (MOEFC), could lead to significant environmental damage, substantial fines, and reputational harm. Another incorrect approach that involves delaying the reporting of potential environmental issues to avoid scrutiny would violate the principles of transparency and accountability enshrined in environmental laws. Such a delay could exacerbate the problem, making remediation more difficult and costly, and could be interpreted as a deliberate attempt to conceal noncompliance, leading to severe legal repercussions. Finally, an approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or informal opinions rather than structured risk assessment and expert consultation would be deficient. This lack of rigorous analysis fails to meet the standards of due diligence required by environmental legislation and could result in unforeseen and unmanaged environmental risks. Professionals at IOCL should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific environmental regulations applicable to their operations. This involves identifying potential hazards, assessing the likelihood and impact of environmental incidents, and developing mitigation strategies. When faced with operational pressures, the framework should mandate consultation with environmental health and safety (AES) departments and, if necessary, external environmental consultants. Transparency in reporting and a commitment to corrective actions, even if they incur short-term costs, are crucial for long-term sustainability and regulatory compliance. Question 14. Investigation of a proposed new refinery expansion project by Indian Oil Corporation Limited in an ecologically sensitive region reveals that the initial environmental impact assessment report submitted to the regulatory authorities has been criticized by local community groups for allegedly downplaying potential water contamination risks. The project team is under pressure from senior management to expedite the approval process to meet ambitious production targets. What is the most appropriate course of action for the project manager at Indian Oil? Option A. Request a temporary halt to the approval process to conduct a targeted review of the specific water contamination data without involving external stakeholders or initiating a full reassessment. Option B. Authorize the commencement of preliminary site preparation activities while the environmental impact assessment review is ongoing to save time. Option C. Immediately initiate a revised and more comprehensive environmental impact assessment, ensuring all potential risks are thoroughly evaluated and transparently communicated to stakeholders, and engage in constructive dialogue with community groups to address their concerns before resubmitting the report for approval. Option D. Proceed with the current approval process, arguing that the submitted report meets the minimum regulatory requirements, and that community concerns are speculative. The correct answer is C. Immediately initiate a revised and more comprehensive environmental impact assessment, ensuring all potential risks are thoroughly evaluated and transparently communicated to stakeholders, and engage in constructive dialogue with community groups to address their concerns before resubmitting the report for approval. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for rapid expansion and the stringent regulatory requirements governing environmental impact assessments and approvals. Indian Oil Corporation Limited, as a major player in the energy sector, is subject to rigorous environmental protection laws and guidelines in India. The challenge lies in balancing business objectives with legal compliance and ethical responsibilities towards environmental stewardship. A hasty approach without due diligence can lead to severe legal penalties, reputational damage, and long-term environmental harm. The correct approach involves a thorough and transparent environmental impact assessment (IA) process, adhering strictly to the guidelines set by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, MoF and CC, and relevant state pollution control boards. This includes detailed baseline studies, identification of potential environmental impacts, development of mitigation measures, and a comprehensive public consultation process. This approach is justified by the Environment Protection Act, 1986, and the EIA Notification, 2006, as amended, which mandate such assessments for proposed projects to ensure sustainable development and minimize ecological damage. Adherence to these regulations is not merely a legal obligation, but an ethical imperative for a responsible corporate citizen like Indian Oil. An incorrect approach would be to bypass or expedite the EIA process by submitting incomplete or misleading data. This is a direct violation of the EIA Notification, 2006, which requires accurate and comprehensive information for the appraisal of projects. Such an action would undermine the integrity of the regulatory framework and could lead to the approval of a project that poses significant environmental risks. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with construction without obtaining the necessary environmental clearances. This contravenes Section 15 of the Environment Protection Act, 1986, which prescribes penalties for noncompliance and demonstrates a blatant disregard for environmental laws. Furthermore, neglecting to conduct meaningful public consultations, as mandated by the EIA notification, would be an ethical failure, as it disenfranchises stakeholders and prevents legitimate concerns from being addressed. Professionals at Indian Oil should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct. This involves understanding the full scope of applicable environmental regulations, engaging qualified environmental consultants, ensuring data integrity, fostering transparency in all dealings with regulatory bodies and the public, and embedding a culture of environmental responsibility throughout the organization. When faced with pressure to accelerate projects, professionals must advocate for adherence to established procedures, highlighting the long-term risks of noncompliance. Question 15. Operational review demonstrates that a proposed cost-saving measure for a critical pipeline maintenance project at an Indian oil facility involves using a new, unproven material that is significantly cheaper, but whose long-term durability and environmental impact under Indian operating conditions are not fully established. The project team is eager to implement this to meet budget targets. Which of the following approaches best navigates this implementation challenge while adhering to Indian Oil's operational standards and relevant Indian regulations? Option A. Implement the new material but document the decision as a pilot project with a caveat for future remediation if issues arise, prioritizing the immediate budget achievement. Option B. Proceed with the new material, relying on the vendor's assurances of compliance and the potential for significant cost savings, while deferring further independent testing until after implementation. Option C. Seek an internal waiver from the standard material approval process, citing the urgent need for cost reduction and the project's tight deadline, and proceed with the cheaper option. Option D. Halt the implementation of the new material and initiate a comprehensive, independent testing and certification process in accordance with Indian safety and environmental standards, engaging with relevant regulatory bodies for guidance, and exploring alternative compliant materials if the new material fails to meet stringent requirements. Correct answer is B. Proceed with the new material, relying on the vendor's assurances of compliance and the potential for significant cost savings, while deferring further independent testing until after implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between operational efficiency and the stringent regulatory compliance required by Indian Oil. The need to balance cost-effectiveness with adherence to safety and environmental standards, as mandated by Indian Oil's internal guidelines and relevant Indian legislation, demands careful judgment. Missteps can lead to significant financial penalties, reputational damage, and potential harm to personnel and the environment. The correct approach involves a thorough, multi-stakeholder review that prioritizes regulatory adherence and safety above immediate cost savings. This entails engaging with the relevant regulatory bodies, conducting comprehensive risk assessments, and exploring alternative solutions that meet all compliance requirements, even if they incur higher initial costs. This aligns with the principles of responsible corporate governance and the legal obligations of Indian Oil under Indian law, which emphasizes the paramount importance of safety and environmental protection in the oil and gas sector. An incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate cost reduction without adequate regulatory scrutiny is professionally unacceptable. This would likely violate Indian Oil's internal safety protocols and potentially contravene specific provisions of Indian environmental and occupational safety laws, such as those under the Factories Act, 1948, or the Environment Protection Act, 1986, which mandate specific safety measures and pollution control standards. Another incorrect approach that involves bypassing established internal approval processes for cost-saving measures, even if seemingly minor, undermines the integrity of Indian Oil's compliance framework. This can lead to unforeseen risks and a lack of accountability, deviating from best practices in corporate governance and internal control mechanisms. A further incorrect approach that relies solely on vendor assurances without independent verification of compliance with Indian regulations is also professionally flawed. This abdicates responsibility for due diligence and exposes Indian Oil to significant legal and operational risks if the vendor's claims are inaccurate or their practices fall short of Indian legal requirements. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk-based approach. This includes identifying the regulatory requirements applicable to the situation, assessing the potential risks associated with each proposed solution, both financially and in terms of compliance, consulting with legal and compliance departments, seeking expert advice where necessary, and documenting all decisions and justifications thoroughly. Prioritizing safety and regulatory compliance, even when it presents a short-term cost disadvantage, is fundamental to ethical and sustainable operations within the Indian oil and gas industry. Question 16. The performance metrics show a slight dip in efficiency at a remote pumping station, coinciding with an unconfirmed minor oil sheen observed on a nearby water body. As an engineer at Indian Oil, what is the most appropriate immediate action to take? Option A. Immediately report the observed sheen and potential efficiency dip to the Environmental Compliance Department and the station manager, initiating the company's incident reporting protocol. Option B. Document the efficiency dip and the sheen observation in your personal notes, but wait for further confirmation or a directive from higher management before taking any official action. Option C. Continue monitoring the situation closely and focus on rectifying the efficiency dip, assuming the sheen is minor and will dissipate naturally without intervention. Option D. Attempt to discreetly clean up the sheen using available station resources to avoid any potential negative reporting or regulatory scrutiny. The correct answer is A. Immediately report the observed sheen and potential efficiency dip to the Environmental Compliance Department and the station manager, initiating the company's incident reporting protocol. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an Indian Oil employee because it requires balancing the company's operational efficiency with adherence to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. The pressure to meet performance targets can create a temptation to overlook or downplay potential environmental risks, making sound judgment and a commitment to regulatory frameworks paramount. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent reporting of the observed anomaly to the relevant internal departments and regulatory bodies, as per Indian Oil's established environmental management protocols, and the applicable environmental laws of India. This demonstrates a commitment to corporate responsibility, environmental stewardship, and legal compliance. Specifically, Indian environmental laws, such as the Environment Protection Act, 1986, and associated rules, mandate reporting of pollution incidents and require companies to take measures to prevent and control environmental damage. Adhering to these regulations is not just a legal obligation, but also an ethical imperative for a company like Indian Oil, which operates in a sensitive sector. An incorrect approach of ignoring the spill or attempting to conceal it would constitute a severe regulatory and ethical failure. This would violate the principles of environmental protection enshrined in Indian law, potentially leading to significant fines, legal penalties, and reputational damage for Indian Oil. Furthermore, it would breach the ethical duty of an employee to act in the best interest of the company and society by prioritizing short-term gains over long-term environmental sustainability and public safety. Another incorrect approach of attempting to clean up the spill without proper reporting or expert assessment could lead to inadequate containment and remediation, potentially exacerbating the environmental damage. This bypasses established protocols designed to ensure effective response and compliance with environmental standards, risking further pollution and noncompliance with regulatory requirements for spill response and reporting. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of the company's internal policies on environmental management and safety, coupled with a thorough knowledge of relevant Indian environmental legislation. Employees should be trained to identify potential risks, report them promptly through designated channels, and cooperate fully with investigations and remediation efforts. Prioritizing transparency, compliance, and environmental responsibility over immediate performance pressures is crucial for maintaining the integrity of Indian Oil and upholding its commitment to sustainable operations. Question 17. When evaluating a potential personal investment opportunity that could create a conflict of interest with their role at Indian Oil Corporation Limited, what is the most appropriate course of action for an employee? Option A. Immediately disclose the potential conflict of interest to the designated authority within Indian Oil Corporation Limited and seek guidance on managing the situation. Option B. Invest discreetly and only disclose if directly questioned by management about potential conflicts. Option C. Proceed with the investment if the potential personal gain is significant and unlikely to be detected by the company. Option D. Discuss the investment with close colleagues to gauge their opinion on whether disclosure is necessary. Correct answer is A. Immediately disclose the potential conflict of interest to the designated authority within Indian Oil Corporation Limited and seek guidance on managing the situation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee of Indian Oil Corporation Limited (IOCL) due to the inherent conflict between personal financial interests and the company's ethical standards and regulatory compliance obligations. Maintaining public trust and ensuring fair business practices are paramount for public sector undertaking like IOCL. The employee must navigate this situation with utmost integrity, adhering strictly to the guidelines set forth by IOCL and relevant Indian laws governing public sector employees and corporate conduct. The correct approach involves immediate and transparent disclosure of the potential conflict of interest to the appropriate authority within IOCL. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and the ethical framework expected of employees in public sector organizations. Specifically, IOCL internal policies, likely mirroring broader government directives for public sector undertakings, would mandate such disclosure to prevent any perception or reality of undue influence or personal gain at the expense of the company's interests. This proactive disclosure allows IOCL to manage the conflict appropriately, potentially by recusing the employee from relevant decision-making processes or by implementing other safeguards. This upholds the integrity of IOCL operations and demonstrates adherence to principles of fairness and transparency, which are critical for maintaining stakeholder confidence and regulatory compliance under Indian law. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the investment without informing IOCL. This constitutes a failure to disclose a potential conflict of interest, which is a direct violation of ethical codes and likely specific clauses within IOCL service rules or conduct rules. Such a failure can lead to disciplinary action, damage to the employee's reputation, and potential legal repercussions for both the employee and IOCL if impropriety is later discovered. Another incorrect approach would be to seek advice from colleagues who are not in a position of authority or are not designated to handle such matters. This bypasses the formal reporting channels and may result in inadequate or misleading advice, further compounding the ethical breach. Finally, attempting to conceal the investment or its potential implications would be a severe ethical and regulatory failure, indicating a lack of integrity and a deliberate attempt to circumvent established procedures designed to protect the company and its stakeholders. Professionals in similar situations should adopt a framework of proactive transparency and adherence to established protocols. This involves recognizing potential conflicts of interest, understanding the relevant company policies and legal frameworks, and reporting the situation to the designated authority without delay. The decision-making process should prioritize the company's ethical standards and regulatory obligations over personal gain or convenience. Question 18. The audit findings indicate a potential process optimization in the refining unit at Indian Oil Corporation Limited that could significantly reduce operational downtime. However, the proposed changes appear to bypass certain established safety interlocks and environmental monitoring protocols. As a process engineer, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the proposed optimization against all relevant IOCL safety policies, environmental regulations, and standard operating procedures, consulting with safety and environmental departments before any decision is made. Option B. Inform the audit team that the proposed optimization is a necessary step for efficiency and that the existing protocols are overly stringent. Option C. Proceed with the optimization, but instruct the unit operators to manually monitor the bypass safety interlocks and environmental parameters. Option D. Immediately implement the proposed optimization to reduce downtime, as this is a key performance indicator for the unit. The correct answer is D. Immediately implement the proposed optimization to reduce downtime, as this is a key performance indicator for the unit. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Indian Oil Corporation Limited, IOCL, due to the inherent conflict between the need for operational efficiency and the imperative to adhere to established safety and environmental regulations. The audit findings highlight a potential deviation from standard operating procedures, SOP, that could have significant implications for safety, environmental compliance, and the company's reputation. Careful judgment is required to balance the immediate pressure for process optimization with the long-term consequences of noncompliance. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the identified process optimization proposal against all relevant IOCL policies, safety guidelines, and environmental regulations. This includes consulting with the relevant technical departments, safety officers, and environmental compliance teams to ensure that any proposed changes do not compromise safety standards, increase environmental risks, or violate any statutory requirements. This approach is professionally sound because it prioritizes regulatory adherence and risk mitigation, which are fundamental ethical and legal obligations for any employee in a company like IOCL. It ensures that any optimization is achieved within the bounds of the law and company policy, safeguarding both personnel and the environment. An incorrect approach would be to immediately implement the proposed optimization without proper scrutiny. This fails to acknowledge the critical importance of regulatory compliance and safety protocols, potentially leading to accidents, environmental damage, and legal penalties for IOCL. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the proposal outright without a proper technical and regulatory review. This stifles innovation and potential improvements that could genuinely benefit the company, provided they are implemented responsibly and in compliance with all applicable laws and internal guidelines. A third incorrect approach would be to seek a workaround that circumvents established procedures, even if it appears to achieve the optimization goal. This demonstrates a disregard for the integrity of the company's control systems and regulatory framework, fostering a culture of noncompliance. Professionals in such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. This involves 1. Understanding the full scope of the audit findings and the proposed optimization. 2. Identifying all relevant internal policies, safety standards, and external regulations. 3. Consulting with subject matter experts within IOCL e.g., safety, environment, engineering. 4. Conducting a comprehensive risk assessment of the proposed changes. 5. Documenting the entire process, including the rationale for any decision. 6. Escalating concerns or seeking approval through the appropriate channels. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with the company's commitment to safety, environmental stewardship, and legal compliance. Question 19. Analysis of a situation where an Indian Oil Corporation Limited (IOCL) procurement officer discovers that a company being evaluated for a significant contract is owned by their close relative. The officer is responsible for assessing the technical and commercial proposals of all bidders. What is the most appropriate course of action for the IOCL officer to ensure the integrity of the procurement process and uphold ethical standards? Option A. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to the designated vigilance officer or reporting manager and recuse themselves from any further involvement in the evaluation of that specific vendor's proposal. Option B. Proceed with the evaluation as planned, ensuring impartiality, and only disclose the relationship if any irregularities are discovered during the process. Option C. Continue the evaluation and recommend the relative-owned company if their proposal is deemed the best, believing that personal relationships should not hinder fair business dealings. Option D. Discreetly inform the relative-owned company about the evaluation criteria and offer guidance to improve their proposal to ensure they are competitive. Correct answer is A. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to the designated vigilance officer or reporting manager and recuse themselves from any further involvement in the evaluation of that specific vendor's proposal. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Indian Oil Corporation Limited (IOCL) due to the potential conflict between personal interests and the company's ethical standards and regulatory obligations. The need for careful judgment arises from the requirement to act in the best interest of IOCL while adhering to the principles of transparency and fairness, particularly when dealing with a potential vendor. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent disclosure of the personal relationship to the relevant authorities within IOCL. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and ethical conduct expected of employees in public sector undertakings like IOCL. Specifically, it adheres to the spirit and letter of any internal codes of conduct or vigilance guidelines that mandate disclosure of potential conflicts of interest. By informing the designated officials, the employee ensures that IOCL can take appropriate measures to maintain the integrity of its procurement processes, preventing any perception of favoritism or undue influence. This approach upholds the company's commitment to fair competition and ethical business practices, which are paramount in the oil and gas sector. An incorrect approach of remaining silent and proceeding with the vendor evaluation would be a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This silence could be interpreted as an attempt to conceal a potential conflict of interest, thereby undermining the trust placed in the employee by IOCL. It violates the fundamental principle of acting with integrity and could lead to accusations of bias, even if no actual impropriety occurred. Such a failure could also contravene specific provisions within IOCL Vigilance Manual or employee conduct rules that address conflicts of interest and the duty to report them. Another incorrect approach of directly informing the vendor about the evaluation process and offering assurances would be equally problematic. This action not only fails to address the conflict of interest, but actively exacerbates it by creating an impression of preferential treatment. It bypasses established procurement protocols and could be seen as an attempt to influence the outcome, directly violating principles of fair bidding and transparency. This would be a clear breach of IOCL procurement policies and potentially lead to disciplinary action, including disqualification of the vendor and reputational damage to IOCL. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of IOCL internal policies on ethics, vigilance, and conflict of interest. Employees should be encouraged to err on the side of caution and disclose any situation that could reasonably be perceived as a conflict. The framework involves identifying the potential conflict, understanding the relevant internal guidelines and external regulations, if applicable, though the focus here is internal, seeking guidance from the appropriate internal authority, e.g., Vigilance Department, HR, or Reporting Manager, and acting strictly in accordance with their advice. Transparency and adherence to established procedures are the cornerstones of ethical conduct in such scenarios. Question 20. Benchmark analysis indicates that Indian Oil is considering a significant expansion of its refining capacity in a region with sensitive ecological zones and a densely populated local community. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework and ethical considerations for such a project in India? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive environmental and social impact assessment (ESA) involving expert studies, public consultations, and detailed mitigation plans, adhering strictly to the Environment Protection Act, 1986, and the EIA Notification, 2006. Option B. Expedite project approval by focusing primarily on the projected revenue streams and economic benefits, with only a cursory review of potential environmental concerns. Option C. Rely on past project experiences and informal discussions with local authorities to gauge community sentiment and environmental risks, bypassing formal assessment procedures. Option D. Prioritize cost reduction measures in the initial project planning phase, deferring detailed environmental impact studies until after construction has commenced. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive environmental and social impact assessment (ESA) involving expert studies, public consultations, and detailed mitigation plans, adhering strictly to the Environment Protection Act, 1986, and the EIA Notification, 2006. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge for an Indian oil employee due to the inherent conflict between the company's strategic growth objectives and the potential environmental and social impacts of a new project. The need for careful judgment arises from balancing economic imperatives with regulatory compliance and corporate social responsibility, particularly within the context of Indian environmental and corporate governance laws. The correct approach involves a comprehensive impact assessment that rigorously evaluates the potential environmental, social, and economic consequences of the proposed project. This approach is ethically and regulatorily sound because it aligns with the principles of sustainable development and the requirements of Indian environmental legislation, such as the Environment Protection Act, 1986, and Associated Environmental Impact Assessment (IA) Notification, 2006. These regulations mandate thorough assessment and public consultation to ensure projects are environmentally viable and socially acceptable. By prioritizing a detailed and objective assessment, the company demonstrates a commitment to responsible business practices and avoids potential legal repercussions and reputational damage. An approach that prioritizes immediate cost savings over a thorough impact assessment is ethically flawed because it disregards the potential for long-term environmental degradation and social disruption, which can lead to significant penalties and legal challenges under Indian environmental laws. This approach also violates the principles of corporate social responsibility, which are increasingly expected of major corporations like Indian Oil. An approach that focuses solely on the project's potential revenue generation without considering adverse impacts is professionally unsound. It demonstrates a narrow, short-term perspective that neglects the broader stakeholder interests and regulatory obligations. Such a focus can lead to non-compliance with environmental clearances and can result in significant fines, project delays, or even cancellation, as stipulated by Indian environmental statutes. An approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or informal consultations rather than a structured, data-driven impact assessment is professionally deficient. It fails to meet the rigorous standards required by Indian environmental regulations for obtaining necessary approvals and can expose the company to legal challenges from affected communities or environmental groups. This lack of systematic evaluation undermines the credibility of the assessment and increases the risk of unforeseen negative consequences. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the full scope of regulatory requirements, including environmental, social, and corporate governance mandates applicable in India. This should be followed by a commitment to conducting thorough, evidence-based assessments that consider all potential impacts. Engaging with relevant stakeholders, including regulatory bodies, local communities, and environmental experts, is crucial throughout the process. Finally, decisions should be made based on the findings of these comprehensive assessments, prioritizing long-term sustainability and compliance over short-term gains.